recording now, and I am
Hey, there we go. That
trying
right.
to go live.
It says it's recording and that we've been joined by a Mr. Robert Daniel. Hey, I know him.
Yes. Press go live. I'm trying to press go live. All right. Why is this not? All right. So it's not letting me stream to YouTube yet because apparently I just verified the account and I'm not sure why I am not able to go live on Facebook yet, but I'm trying to. So if you are somehow hearing us, welcome to the first Town Hall Thursdays. I am Darryl W. Perry, and I'm joined by Mr. Zachary Dumont, who is the Libertarian for Congress in the 1st District of New Hampshire. Zach, thank you for joining me.
Darryl, thank you very much for the invite. It's always nice to be able to get out and start talking a bit about the message.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that I started these, and I need to remember to look at the camera instead of looking at all of the little buttons and bells and whistles all around me as I try to get things to actually wind up working right. With events being canceled, there's not really the option for what New Hampshire is known for, and that is retail politics, where you get out and you meet voters and you talk to them in person and you go to the Red Arrow Diner and you go to Lindy's and you do all of this other stuff that you're supposed to do when you're campaigning or running for a high-level office. And well, as we've seen with certain presidential candidates where they're doing Zooms in their basement, I am not in my basement. I do have an office for the campaign. That's where I am. And Zach, it looks like you're kind of in an office as well. And I know that you've done some live streams or
just a few
recorded some things.
Yes, I have a very tiny, awfully hot office. But hey, it works and it's not too echoey, so can't complain.
Yeah. And again, thanks for joining me. And I did want to talk about something that I know you'll probably be faced with answering or covering in your campaign because, well, there's pending federal legislation on this, and that would be qualified immunity.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to explain what qualified immunity is a little bit while I, again, work on the back ends and hopefully make sure that we're streaming here?
Sure. So qualified immunity, as I understand it, is a process that came about via court resolution that basically allows police officers to exempt themselves from being held responsible for a number of different laws, rules, regulations, etc. The easiest way to look at it is you cannot sue a police officer for in civil court for an action that they have taken if they were doing so as a result of their employment. So if you're a police officer and you pull somebody over and in that interaction you end up beating up that individual can't come back and sue you individually and hold you responsible for your actions. They'd have to go after the municipality. If a judgment was found in that person's favor, the taxpayer is now on the hook for whatever the settlement is, and the officer, for the most part, gets to walk free. And this whole notion of qualified immunity has basically created this very awkward and shielded secondary system in which you have police officers that are supposed to serve as public servants that are held to a separate and different standard from every other public servant that, has to go. I mean, for example, a good way to look at it is Donald Trump has been sued nonstop since he took office in the White House, but you can't do that to your local police officer who decided to accost you, threaten you, etc. So it's this really nasty and unhelpful legal framework that we have, and I'm very much on board with us looking at a way to get rid of that. Darryl, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, and just sort of to expound a little bit on what you were saying about you can't sue, there are a handful of small exceptions of if the federal courts or the court in that jurisdiction has found that previously police were guilty of committing the same exact civil rights violation. So there was the recent case where the Supreme Court refused to hear the case where a police dog was sicked on a person that I forget if they had, like had their hands up and said, I'm not resisting, or if they were already handcuffed. But because that had not been done previously, this individual could not sue the police for what happened. There's also in various levels statutory immunity that's different than qualified immunity. But again, it's a thing of, oh, well, you didn't state the exact way that your rights were violated, so therefore you can't sue for whatever reason. I had an incident here in New Hampshire, actually, about 8 years ago, where I was working a very late second shift, and I would get home about 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, generally go to bed about 6 a.m. because, it's a late second shift. I'm not going to bed as soon as I get home. Relax a little bit. The fire department and the zoning department decided to come into the place where I was living to execute some kind of warrant to look for smoke detectors. And they woke me up. I just wanted an apology for being awoken 3 hours after I went to sleep. And because you also need to ask for some kind of monetary compensation, I said, all right, give me $20 a day for every day that I've not been given an apology. And so, of course, the city of Keene filled out this thing of, well, we have all of these immunities. And so I filed a rebuttal to that saying, like, they're appealing to their own authority. This is invalid. So we had a hearing. And then, of course, the judge said, I failed to state a claim upon which relief might be granted. The homeowner actually wound up having a hearing about somewhere between 3 and 6 months later. And it was deemed that the warrant that was executed was completely invalid. So had I just waited until the warrant was deemed invalid, I could have been given my apology, because then I would have been able to state the claim or the claim upon which relief might be granted. And you had mentioned about looking at some legislative solution to get rid of qualified immunity. The Libertarian member of Congress, and I love being able to say that now, Justin Amash from Michigan actually introduced the Ending Qualified Immunity Act. That is a very short bill. And unfortunately, I don't have the text pulled up in front of me, but I can pull it up very quickly, where it's really just saying, like, we should get rid of qualified immunity.
I actually have it here for you if you'd like it.
Excellent. If you go to, I believe it's the 4th page, because the first couple of pages are, here's the findings of why we need to do this. And then it's just like one paragraph. Can you read that paragraph to us?
Of course. Section 4, removal of qualified immunity. Section 1979 of the revised statutes, 42 U.S.C. 1983, is amended by adding at the end the following. Quote, it shall not be a defense or immunity to any action brought under this section that the defendant was acting in good faith or that the defendant believed, reasonably or otherwise, that his or her conduct was lawful at the time when it was committed. Nor shall it be a defense or immunity that the rights, privileges, or immunities secured by the Constitution or laws were not clearly established at the time of their deprivation by the defendant, or that the state of the law was otherwise such that the defendant could not reasonably have been expected to know whether his or her conduct was lawful. End quote.
Yeah, so basically, the plain English version here is just because you're a cop and just because you're following orders doesn't mean you get to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's kind of what that says, right? And I believe, and Zach, correct me if I'm wrong here, but wasn't there some kind of commission or hearings that wound up finding that just because you're following orders doesn't mean that you're allowed to do that?
That does sound vaguely familiar.
Yeah, Nuremberg something.
I'll let you dig into the history books and pull that one back out. I did also want to mention, since you had brought it up, the case that you were referencing earlier was Baxter v Bracy. That was the police dog being sicked on an individual who was surrendering to police at the time.
Yeah, and again, the Supreme Court refused to hear it because, well, they explained it in their decision, but wasn't there only one Supreme Court justice that dissented on not wanting to hear that case? I think there was one that wanted to hear the case.
You'll have to give me a moment to pull that up.
Yeah, and
I just pulled the writ.
Yeah, and again, apologies if you're looking for this on Facebook or YouTube to be live. Apologies. It will get posted later. And I realize that you're not hearing the apology live, but you'll hear the apology once you find the video.
It was Justice Thomas was the only justice that dissented.
Yeah,
dissented the denial of the writ certiorari.
Right, and that's kind of surprising that Clarence Thomas was the one that dissented there because he's not really seen as one of the more liberal justices, and getting rid of qualified immunity is not something that conservatives tend to support.
Yeah, the stalwart law and order justice actually said something that was anti what you'd normally think.
I do want to remind the viewers that are in the Zoom that you can submit questions in the chat. And actually, if you're watching any other way and you do want to ask questions, I'm only checking the Zoom for questions. So once I do figure out how to actually get these on YouTube and Facebook Live, I'll only be checking Zoom. You can find the Zoom very easily at darrylwperry.com/Zoom. So put in any questions and we'll answer those as we get around to them. And another point that I want to make sure that I mention is that even though on the Facebook event it is listed as going 6 to 7 o'clock, I want to go at least 30 minutes, a maximum of 60. So if you join a little later and we're not here, that will explain why on that. And again, thank you to everybody joining the Zoom. And Zach, thanks again for joining me. Did you have a chance to look over the Daca ruling that came down from the Supreme Court earlier today?
Ever so slightly. Basically, what I had pulled from it was that the Supreme Court had determined that while DACA may or may not necessarily be legal, the actions that the Trump administration took to end DACA were not just and proper.
Right.
Which,
DACA, for those that might not be familiar with the acronym, is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program that was implemented via executive order by Barack Obama. And I know that there's a lot of questions that some people have about whether DACA was even legal to be implemented in the first place. And one of the arguments in favor that I happen to agree with is that a president can pardon someone for a crime, or they can grant some form of clemency for any crime that may or may not have been committed. And crossing a border without permission of some government agency, or overstaying whatever permission that you do have. So there's a lot of people that will show up with a visa, and then for whatever reason, they overstay the visa. If you delay punishment, which is what DACA does, then that's essentially a form of clemency. And people that there's a lot of requirements to actually qualify for DACA protection, but for the people that do qualify for those protections, and the protection is largely deportation and not being able to ever legally cross the border again, for the people that do qualify for that, it's essentially a form of clemency. And because it was done via executive order instead of through the legislature, there's questions about whether it was ever legal, but very few executive orders ever actually get challenged to begin with. I find it interesting that this was one of the ones that wound up being challenged, although it was a challenge to the repeal of DACA. It wasn't a challenge to a completely new executive order, if you will. But I do have to agree with the Supreme Court here that, and I wish that they would have gone further, but again, they can only really answer the questions that are asked of them, because that's how courts work. Unless you're the first Supreme Court, when, Marbury versus Madison, they answered a completely separate question, and that's how we got judicial review.
It helps when you can grant yourself powers and run wild with it, I suppose. Yes. On the DACA decision, when DACA was first issued, I found myself rather annoyed with the idea of that program, because at the time I was more of the very steadfast, we had borders, you illegally crossed them, therefore it's a crime, etc. My mood on that has changed significantly in the past few years, where, I don't necessarily agree with just granting immunity, but it makes sense at this point to take a group of folks who have been in this country for 22 some years, if not longer, if not slightly shorter than that. They're Americans at this point. They're contributing to our society. They haven't done anything wrong. So, some people may break laws, but the vast majority of these people are here because they want to have a good life, and it's the only life they've ever known. There are far too many cases of people who have been deported by ICE because, you were brought here illegally, 45 years ago. So let me just dump you off in your home country that you have no familiarity with and see if you can survive.
Yeah, there was actually an article or story. I say article because I read an article about it.
Yeah.
But there was a news story a few years ago where I believe it was someone from the Seattle area that, as a child, was adopted from either Korea or Vietnam, brought over, and because his parents, 40 years ago, didn't fill out all of the paperwork properly, mm-hmm. which he never knew that they didn't fill out the paperwork properly because he was a toddler. And then he gets a notice of, you're being deported because you're not here legally. So he went to a country that he had no recollection of, and he did not speak the language. Mm-hmm. Like, he only knew, living in America and speaking English. And then he's sent to this other country, and because he was one of them illegals, and I'm using air quotes there for anybody that might not be watching video while watching or listening to this, he could never wind up coming back to the country because he had been deported. And that's just wrong, really. But since we're on the topic, New Hampshire is a border state. So let's discuss immigration and border control for a little bit.
Well, Darryl, I don't know about you, but I would feel way safer in New Hampshire if I knew that every time I was traveling through the town of Woodstock, I'd be accosted by border agents.
Yeah, I would feel much safer if they reduced the border zone down from 100 miles to about 100 feet. I know that there's been discussion over the last couple of years of should we reduce the border zone from 100 miles to 25 miles?
Mm-hmm.
And I still think that's too far. Like, put it
Don't
down
get us
to
wrong.
about
We'll
100
take
feet.
25 if that's all you're giving.
Right, I'll take it, but then I'll wind up asking, can we get something better?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of the border, especially up in the New England area, where there's just a whole lot of nothing.
It's moose, it's trees, and it's bears.
But if you live in one of those towns where there's a whole lot of nothing,
Mhm.
and you want to drive down to a part of the state where there's a something, you really only have one or two roads that you can drive on. And if both of those roads have border checkpoints, you're essentially being treated as living in a foreign country.
Yeah. When I first got elected to the Newmarket Town Council, I had made some comments, since I now had a platform, speaking back against the governor for allowing this to occur within our own state. I personally crossed the Canadian border for the first time back in January this year, because I was coming back from Canada. I'd spent New Year's up there with the fiance, and I was just blown away. It was fairly quick to get through, but from crossing the border, where we were the only person at 2 or 3 o'clock on the afternoon of New Year's Day, we were followed for about 10 to 15 miles by a Border Patrol vehicle as we made our way down into the town of Pittsburgh. So there's nobody crossing the border except us, just two people trying to get home so we can go back to work the next day. And here we are in the middle of a blizzard, surrounded by trees and snow, with a big white Border Patrol vehicle following us 15 miles into town for no reason other than to follow us. And my question is, I thought I was in America. I thought I was in New Hampshire, a state that respected people's rights. Why are you coming after me? What are you even looking for?
Yeah.
It's madness. It's a waste of time and money. And to think that can happen as far into pretty much across the state, because all of New Hampshire falls within that 100-mile border zone.
Right. And I know that there was a state Supreme Court decision, was it last year, I believe, where the court wound up throwing out some drug convictions because the local police weren't properly authorized in allowing the feds to use their drug dog.
Yeah, I believe that was
something along those lines.
You go through the border checkpoint, and also while we're here, town of Woodstock PD are going to have drug dogs come over and sniff out your car and ask you to step out and search the vehicle without your permission or consent. Yeah, because you're at a border checkpoint and you have to submit to it, even though you're not.
Right. And I really wish that the governor, which maybe that'll be me next year, would wind up telling the feds, you aren't allowed to set up your checkpoint inside my state.
Well, Darryl, you do have to remember, this is the governor that's been intentionally delaying reopening the state so he can continue to get government money to fund his projects and his plans. So yeah. Don't ask too much from Governor Sununu.
Yeah, and let's talk about this delayed reopening, because up until 3 days ago, from early to mid-March, we had been under stay-at-home orders. Now we're under a safer at home advisory, which, while not an order, definitely better, but there is the connotation that it's still not safe for us to go petition and circulate papers and come into close contact with tens of thousands of voters. Mm-hmm. And the Secretary of State and the Attorney General actually issued guidance 2 months ago now, I think, that said that voters should not have to choose between their health and their right to vote. But we're still expected to wind up, again, encountering tens of thousands of voters to get petitions to be able to get onto the ballot. So we've got a pending lawsuit. And there was also a recent decision that allows people to submit certain forms to city and town clerks electronically so that the election officials don't have to deal with potentially contaminated paper. So, well, what are your thoughts on all of this?
So this is the first time I've ever run for a national office, and I'd be lying if I didn't say that I wasn't planning on doing it this soon, but the time seemed right until coronavirus came. So for me, the idea of having to go out and petition to get on the ballot isn't necessarily out of the question. I think what bothers me more so is the fact that if you say that you're a member of the Republican Party or you say that you're a member of the Democratic Party, you just get access free of charge. You spend the, $50 to file the paperwork and you're on. That's it. You don't have to put in any effort other than do that.
Right.
But if you choose to operate outside the normal, major party boundaries, because God forbid you think for yourself, you have to hit these hurdles. If you want to be governor or senator, you need to go out and contact 3,000 voters and hope that their information on their petition is valid, lest it gets thrown out. If you're running for Congress, it's 1,500. I believe the state house is 150. It's just absolutely foolish.
Which, if you wound up proportionalizing the statewide numbers for state house candidates should only need, like 7 to 15 petitions, depending on the district size. State Senate is, I think, 700 something, same for executive council, which again, it's not proportion at all. And you mentioned, if you're outside of the two-party system, which somewhere around 40% of New Hampshire voters are. You've got to wind up, jumping through all of these hoops and hurdles. And who makes those hoops and hurdles, Zachary?
I believe that would be the Democrat and Republican Party.
The Republicans and Democrats. Now, I know that, again, you're running for Congress, so some of the ways that we would approach things are definitely going to be a little bit different. But again, the Libertarian congressman, Justin Amash, had introduced legislation last year, I believe it was, that would have wound up saying that no state for congressional elections can have requirements for non-party candidates that are more stringent than whatever the requirements for the major party candidates are. If elected, is that something that you would wind up looking at and possibly supporting?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I kind of lost audio a bit.
Yeah, so if elected to Congress, would you look into supporting something that would wind up saying that state governments can't set requirements for non-party congressional candidates that are more stringent than what the requirements are for the major party candidates?
Yes, so I would 110% be down for supporting action akin to what you've described. The way I read the U.S. Constitution, it's the House of Representatives and the Senate determine their own elections. They can choose the qualifications for their members and how they want to bring new members into the fold. I think that it wouldn't be out of the question to say that, hey, we need people for our federal delegation. You need to conform to equal rules for all people looking to have access to that. It doesn't make sense to create a first, second, and third tiered system based off of how much money you can raise privately for your campaigns.
And actually, it's not just that Congress can set rules for congressional elections, it's that Congress can set rules for all federal elections, which includes the election of president. So, the bill that Justin Amash introduced could have gone further to say that no state could wind up making the rules more strict for a non-major party presidential candidate, which again is something that I do find interesting, but like carrying it out. And then I know that there's a lot of libertarians that by the whole federalism thing and federal government shouldn't tell any state government what to do except for, X, Y, and Z. They're certain little pet projects.
I personally, I respect the idea of federalism. I think that it worked out well, 2 centuries ago. I think it could still work now if we didn't have so much entrenchment and hyper partisanship.
Right.
But I think that, most reasonable people would be willing to agree that ensuring that there's, equal opportunity to access offices to ensure that your states have equal representation and have their say, it should be agreeable amongst most people.
Yeah. So let's jump into the Q&A real quick.
Yeah.
David Demarest says, Darryl, what is your position on political borders typical of non-competitive my way or the highway governments? And Zach, I'll let you take a stab at this too if you want. But my thoughts on, government-run borders is that, well, they treat people differently based on where they're from. It's, oh, you have more rights if you're from this country than if you're from this country. I would love to see, and I don't know if it's something that we will see within my lifetime, but I would love to see polycentric societies to where the governance that you subscribe to is not necessarily tied to the geography of where you live. And it's something that has happened a few times throughout history, but as my lovely wife likes to point out, well, it didn't really work, did it? Because it's not around today. And, it's one of the, few things where we do disagree and have some, I don't want to say heated arguments, but very passionate arguments about whether, non-state governance could wind up working. But yeah, the whole, government border, I don't like. And what a lot of so-called right libertarians support of, oh, well, we should just privatize the border and whoever owns the property along what the government recognizes as the border gets to decide who comes in and who doesn't, which essentially winds up becoming a form of socialism and other people deciding who can come to my house. I know that there's the Hoppian argument that all government controlled land is essentially private property owned by all of America. And so anybody that doesn't want people from other countries coming here should get to say that they can't go onto the public lands, which again, it's this weird mental gymnastic sort of thing that I don't support and I don't buy into. But Zach, I don't know if you have anything to elaborate on. If not, there is a question specifically for you.
Yes, actually, I think it is the same question. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah. There's now a question. There is a question for you that came to me privately from Robert Daniel, who is another one of our libertarian candidates here in New Hampshire. He's running for State House in Hillsborough 11, which is Manchester Ward 4. He says, question for Zachary Dumont. What, in your view, are the most pressing interests of District 1, and what will you do as a congressman to advocate for those interests? And I'll just add a little bit to Robert's question here, that the Portsmouth Naval Yard is something that seems to always be up for discussion whenever the, what do they call it? The BRAC, every time they look at which military bases to possibly close.
Yeah.
Because, well, that's a lot of money for New Hampshire.
So first, I will go on the record saying I have no issue with the naval shipyard. If they find that they want to build ships and it works out well in New Hampshire, we should keep that. But I also now live on the seacoast, so I'm biased for its success. But Robert, I did want to thank you for your question. If you go to my website, dumontnh.com/issues, we do have a couple of blurbs up there. The top 3 issues that I have listed on my site that I personally believe are the most important facing District 1 would be healthcare, its costs, how it's currently implemented, and pretty much run by the insurance companies, protected by government regulation. National security, what we're looking for, at home and abroad in terms of how we choose to defend ourselves, whether that's, the warrantless wiretapping and spying that we have now, or more of a more, common defense kind of thought. And then the third would be criminal justice reform. I did have a very fruitful discussion with Judge Jim Gray the other day about, how we as a country can be better towards our individuals who have been accused of committing crimes, and the fact that, we have the world's largest prison population. It's just disgusting. So as congressman, I would be working mostly to kind of break down those barriers especially within our healthcare system. There's this idea that, you should be able to you should be allowed to purchase healthcare, whatever it is, the care that you want that is the most cost effective for you. I understand that states want to have their certain boundaries for what certain plans should offer, but if a provider in another state can offer that, you should be allowed to purchase from them if it's better for you. But the biggest thing that I care about is direct to consumer healthcare. So you as the patient know what's best for you in consultation with your medical practitioner. You shouldn't have to worry about whether or not you're able to get that care, whether or not you're able to afford that care, whether or not that choice is going to be made for you by somebody else who's not involved with your care. That makes sense. I hope it does.
Let me ask a follow-up here.
Sure.
And then I'll answer the question that Robert has asked of me, related to being able to get the medical care that you want and that you see fit. I believe right now it's 42 states that at some level recognize cannabis as having medicinal value, yet federally it's still recognized as having no medicinal value. Yeah. And if I were to go to Massachusetts and purchase some recreational cannabis because I don't have a medical card, and I come back to New Hampshire, well, I just committed a federal law or a federal crime. Or even if I did have a medical card in New Hampshire, but I bought some in Massachusetts, or I visited Massachusetts and took some across the border, that's a federal crime. So would you, if elected, introduce legislation to wind up removing that federal penalty?
I would be knocking on the White House front door to get the ear of whomever's sitting behind the Oval Office to say, hey, that war on drugs that we started in the 1970s, it's done nothing but exacerbate costs, militarize police, and, harm thousands of people instead of helping them. Let's end that first by rescheduling marijuana, cannabis, cannabinoids. I get it that there's a stigma that's attached to it. For a long time, I was very anti, all drugs, anything related to that. And, at this point, from what we've seen for folks who have benefited from medical marijuana, from people in my own family who were suffering from debilitating diseases that could have had access to that medicines, but have been so ingrained with the notion that any form of relief that doesn't come from a pill bottle prescribed by a pharmacist is, not good for you. It's disheartening. I know people who have personally benefited from it. I don't see why we need to put people in federal prison. Sorry. I don't understand why we have to put people in federal prison or threaten them with that because it's, a plant that grows naturally and we don't like it. And, for all the racist connotations that came with it from so many decades ago.
Yeah. And then Robert has a follow-up for you that says, on that note, what should the role of the FDA be? FDA being Food and Drug Administration, for anyone listening that might not be familiar with the acronym.
Yeah, so I think that the role of the FDA should be one that is more advisory instead of strictly regulatory. I think that while it makes sense to have regulations in certain areas about, known carcinogens that, we should protect people from. The notion that the FDA can basically, depending on how the wind blows that day, make a determination one way or the other that can have drastic and radical implications across the country is too much power that an unelected agency has been given. the fact that the FDA can say, treatment A is appropriate for you, but treatment B isn't. And on the back end, treatment A has 3 corporations that are set to make billions of dollars off of it. And treatment B could be done at, a tenth of the price, but that's not profitable. I mean, that's problematic. It's gross. It's immoral. The FDA needs a serious reconsideration.
Yeah, and now let me jump into the questions that have been submitted for me, because I also have lots of thoughts on the FDA, but that's not a state level issue. So luckily, I don't have to wind up dealing with that. The question for me is, Darryl, as governor, how would you work with a hostile state house, assuming it will not be a libertarian majority? And, well, would also be a hostile state senate as well. But luckily, I have a history with a lot of the members of the state senate and a good many members of the state house as a citizen lobbyist over the last 6 years. Actually, as a registered lobbyist for the last 4 years. So I already do have, a history of being able to work with people that I don't necessarily agree with 100% on things. We just have to realize that, all right, we're working on issue A right now. I don't care what you think about issue B through Z, any of the Greek letters of the alphabet, any of the Cyrillic alphabet, any of the Chinese characters. We're dealing with issue A. And then when we get to issue B, all right, we're dealing with issue B. Whether you supported me or not on issue A is irrelevant. Let's deal with issue B. And I realize that, there's a lot of overlap because there's only a handful of months where the legislature is in session. So, it might be within a matter of hours instead of a matter of days that you're dealing with these different issues, but you do have to be able to do that coalition building. And I've already done that to some extent with most of the Democrats on the House Election Committee and the Senate Election Committee as well. I actually find working with Republicans to be more stressful than working with Democrats on my top level issues, which is Robert's next question of what are your top 3 issues? And if you go to my website, darrylwperry.com/issues, you'll see that I have 3 things listed: criminal justice reform, lower taxation, ballot access, and voting rights. Now, 2 of those are things where, the more liberal members of the House are going to be much easier to work with. Criminal justice reform and voting rights / ballot access. Now, among criminal justice reform, there are a lot of things, such as getting rid of the drug war. And I realize that we can't get rid of the entire drug war because the federal government still exists, but we can wind up allowing for recreational retail cannabis sales in New Hampshire. We can wind up, and we'd actually have expanded cannabis in New Hampshire if it weren't for Governor Sununu. Now, I know that what came out of the legislature did have some tax and regulate into it, but that's happened everywhere that retail cannabis has been introduced. Now, I know that the friendly neighbors to the left of us in Vermont do have something that they call legalized cannabis, but they don't allow for retail sales, same as in DC, where it's legal to have a certain amount, grow a certain number of plants, but you can't sell it. And well, if you can't sell something, is it really legal? Like, just because you can possess it and you can gift it to someone, if I can't go to the store and buy it or order it online and have it legally shipped to my house, then is it really legal? And I would argue No, it's not. So allowing for some form of retail cannabis is something that I know would be able to get through the legislature and would actually get signed by Governor Darryl Perry. Now, because we have a fairly weak governor in New Hampshire, and I know a lot of states like to claim, oh, we've got a weak governor, but we actually do in New Hampshire have a weak governor, where the governor has to actually work with the executive council to pardon people. So I would have to work with the 5 members of the executive council to be able to pardon nonviolent offenders currently sitting in state or county prisons. And that's something that I wish I could single-handedly take care of. But once we wind up getting the legal cannabis, I would then like to start eliminating all other drug possession and distribution laws that are on the books. But let's start with what we know we can get. Of course, advocate for let's completely get rid of the drug war, but oh, we can get this one thing, excellent. That's a start. Let's then continue. And for the ballot access, if there's a Democratic majority, and if there's a governor that is supportive of, for a lack of a better term, liberalizing the ballot access rules, then I think the legislature might wind up passing something over the objection of the Secretary of State, who says it's already too easy for people to run for office. I see the look on your face, Zach, and he actually said
Can I jump in
that.
here just for a second?
Go ahead, please do.
When I filed my paperwork back on, I believe it was June 3rd, just a few weeks back, I was one of, I think, maybe 2 or 3 people that was actually able to go into the Secretary of State's office to fill out the paperwork. It's also worth noting that if you're a politician from a major party like Chris Sununu, you got to have your photo shot with the Secretary of State in the office and whatnot. But, you know, we third parties didn't have that privilege of a press pool. But I had asked Bill Gardner about this, and I said, hey, you know, there's obviously a pending lawsuit in which you're named, and awkwardly enough, I'm also named. You know, what are your thoughts about this? And he made it clear. He said, well, the courts deemed that, you know, we could raise the petition requirement to 5,000 for third parties at any level of running if we wanted to, whether that be state house, congressional, senatorial, or you know, governor. You know, we're nice and we allow you this easy burden to hit, so it's not problematic, so you can have your equal representation. But I have 2 problems with that. One, the fact that to go out and collect those 1,500 petitions, if you were to actually, you know, track the costs for that, it can range anywhere to $7.50 to $13 per signature. For 13,000 signatures, that is a hell of a lot of money. And in addition, if it's so imperative that candidates get reasonable, you know, say from the general public for being allowed to be on the ballot, why is it 2 specific parties are deemed exempt from that? Why are they told that they don't have to jump through those hoops, spend that money, go through, you know, all of that extra, you know, work just to have the ability, an opportunity to represent the state of New Hampshire? The people that I know who are running for office right now are doing it because they genuinely care about their communities. We've not come here from another state and worked in the Trump administration and are doing this for a vanity project, Mr. Mowers. We're doing this because we care about the state of New Hampshire, because we want to make it a better community. We want to keep it an open and welcome community for our businesses, for new movers, for young people, for old people alike. But the fact that we're told that we have to go out and raise $7,000 just so we can get on the ballot is just, it's absolutely insulting. It's foolish. Yes. And I cannot imagine the court system ruling against the Libertarian Party here, especially when you have the governor still saying, don't go visit people, try to stay away, you know, groups of 10 or less, please. It's just, you can't have it both ways.
Restaurants in the most populated counties can only open at 50% capacity. You're still safer to stay at least 6 feet away from people. There was the commission or the committee on election security something that was tasked with finding ways to spend the $3.25 million of CARES Act money earmarked for election things. I went to all but maybe like 3 of their meetings, and all of them that had public comment, either myself or someone else from the Libertarian Party was there to give public comment. And after I gave comment at one of the hearings, Justin O'Donnell, who's our Senate candidate, was on the call. But one of the members of the committee said, well, I don't know if we can spend money to wind up helping libertarians get ballot access. And Justin chimed in and said, well, it costs you $0 to recommend waiving our petitioning requirements. And then later on at another hearing, during the public comment, said, I'd like to remind you that it costs you nothing to make this recommendation. The only recommendation that came out of this committee was to allow us to collect things via email or electronically, even though that is no more efficient than, and probably less efficient than trying to collect via postal mail, where there was a lawsuit in Michigan over that, where the plaintiff mentioned that he sent out petitions to 1,000 people, which is the number of petitions that he needed. He included a self-addressed stamped envelope. He wound up getting 15 petitions back. From 1,000 sent in the mail, he got 15. And I forget what the ultimate cost was per signature, but it was something ridiculous, $100 and something per signature.
I sent out, I believe it was 150 mailings that I self-addressed envelopes, everything else. I think total I had spent $80 to $90 on everything, because some of the stuff I was able to use that I had already had, like my printer ink, the paper. It was mostly postage, but I think out of the 150 I sent, I got 4 responses, which these are people who regularly vote Libertarian, who are very active in the Libertarian community. But that just goes to show you how effective, paper mailing or any sort of direct mailers are.
Yeah.
If they're not, it's not an effective means.
Yeah, but, and I don't know how frequently you send things out to an email list, but even then, just the open rate is generally 20 to 40%, and that's considered good. That's not even counting, of the people that open the email, how many actually click to do anything from the email. That's just, oh yeah, I opened and now delete.
I do want to make it clear here, because I've heard through the grapevine that there's some people who are thinking that Libertarian candidates don't want to put in the extra work to, get the representation to show that they are viable candidates. First, any candidate who's willing to stand up and make an effort to get elected is a viable candidate. You don't have to agree with them, but you have to recognize the fact that they've made an effort. We have an individual running in the state of New Hampshire who changed his name to Nobody, who is running for governor, I believe. Yes. You don't have to agree with him, but respect the fact that he's going out because he wants to make a difference in his community. As a candidate for office, have zero issue going door to door as many hours as it takes and walking to my bare bones to get the petitions that I need and to put my message out there. And I intend to do so. But when I have people who are asking me not to come into their business without wearing a mask, if I'm not going to stay 6 feet away from them, who wouldn't want me at their private residence because they've been, told that this virus is going to kill them and that they are likely to get it. I mean, I don't know what more we can do to attain ballot access, because the only thing that's changed in terms of campaigning is specifically how you interact with people. Right. Normally in person wouldn't be an issue, but the fact that we've been stuck to the online doesn't really change the messaging. It just means that we can't overcome one of the hurdles that the state of New Hampshire is asking us to overcome.
Right. And Robert, I will answer your question and then we'll sort of wrap up. But just, to expand on what you just said, Zach, the reason I started doing these town halls is because all of the fairs and festivals that we would normally be going to starting like this weekend have been canceled.
And I'm very offended by that. I love fair season in New Hampshire. It is my favorite time of year.
The Comic-Con that happens in Manchester, where before the shutdown and pandemic and everything else, I had already reserved a booth for Comic-Con that is scheduled, or rather was scheduled for late September, already been canceled. Luckily, I was able to get a refund on that. And I was getting ready to send out applications, and I actually did send out a couple of applications. Luckily, I didn't send any money with those applications because the instructions clearly said, please don't. But all of the other fairs and festivals where I had applied to be a vendor, canceled. There's one fair that has not yet been canceled, and that's scheduled for sometime in October, which is well after petitioning season anyway.
Yeah, I think that's like 2 months after the primaries held. So.
Yeah, it's just a few weeks before the general election. But we can't do retail politics, nope. So we're stuck to improvising.
So a state that's known for retail politics, being told that you can't do it is just blasphemy.
Yeah. So Robert asked the question, is signature gathering for pay classified as an essential business for the sake of social distancing? And I did not see that on the list of what are deemed essential businesses. And Zach, to get back to something that you had mentioned about the rules for getting on the ballot, the New Hampshire Constitution very plainly says that all inhabitants have the equal right of holding office. But how are we supposed to have the equal right to hold office if we don't have the equal right to actually seek office? So, that's something that I believe if challenged when there's a different Secretary of State, because the current Secretary of State has never lost a ballot access lawsuit brought forth by a minor party or independent candidate, because, well, pretty much all of the federal judges that sit on the bench in Concord know Bill Gardner, and they know him very well, and they don't want to upset their friend.
Yeah, for someone who's so anti-voter and so anti-candidate, he's held his position for 40 years.
Because he's elected by the legislature, and people believe that if Bill Gardner is not the Secretary of State, we can't have the first in the nation primary anymore.
I'd like to point out that if you believe that fallacy, it is not true. It never will be true. There are just as many people who have been fighting to keep this outside of Bill Gardner alone. It's just mind-blowing. Yeah,
but because the first in the nation primary was born while Bill Gardner was Secretary of State, there's this belief that it goes away when he's no longer Secretary of State, even though he's not the one that birthed it. Yeah. So Zach, if you want to give your, not necessarily a closing statement, but just tell people where they can find you.
Yeah.
And I'll do the same, and I'd love to have you back on closer to the election.
Yeah. So my name is Zachary Dumont. I'm running to represent New Hampshire's 1st Congressional District. I've lived in New Hampshire for all 26 years of my life, except for a 4-month period when I lived abroad in China. I love the Granite State, and I'm running because I believe that it is time to return the voice of American people to the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is supposed to embody the common man and the common woman's ideals for what they want for their country. And right now, it's held by politicians who want to sit back, rake in millions of dollars, and never put in a hard day's work. I want to change that. You can reach me at my Facebook page at Dumont for Congress, Twitter, Zachary S. Dumont, and my website directly is www.dumont.nh.com. You can message us any time of day or night. I promise I'll get back to you.
Excellent. Zachary, again, thank you for joining. And I'll be back next Thursday, as I plan to do these every Thursday leading up to the election. And then once the debates happen, well, if we're not in them, I'll be doing something like this anyway, where I just sort of insert myself into whatever winds up being hosted by probably WMUR and the union leader, because they're the only ones that hold a debate at all in this state, which I do find very strange, that a state that prides itself on voter engagement doesn't actually have debates, more than just the one that happens. But yeah, I plan on being here every week. Again, darrylwperry.com/Zoom is how you can join these. The website, darrylwperry.com, and the YouTube is there. I don't have one of those fancy custom short YouTube URLs, but I'll probably wind up just setting a forward of darrylwperry.com/YouTube. Facebook is The Real Darryl W. Perry. Twitter is at Darryl W. Perry. Again, Zach, thanks for joining us, and everybody that jumped into the Zoom, thank you. And I will find a way to get this up on YouTube and Facebook at some point and figure out why the live streams didn't actually work. Zach, again, thank you. Have a good night.